Good morning, Farm and Ranch Management. Chapter 7, 8, and 9, they're all about economic principles. So the economic principles that just is the driver of all of this is something called the three-stage production function. So when we're looking at inputs and outputs, we see a positive relationship between inputs and outputs at all levels until we get to the top, except for the fact that the relationship is not the same. That's where we see this changing slope come into play. And the three-stage production function has, of course, three stages: stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Now, stage 1 is not where we see input use ever, because it simply doesn't make any sense. We can look at growing plants or putting weight on animals, or we can look at input-output functions in terms of swimming a mile. A student talked to me today, and she was a swimmer and talked about her mile time. And if we look at the input of how many laps you swim per day and the output being how fast are you, imagine if you swam 1 lap per day. Would that make you any faster? Well, it wouldn't make you any slower, and it might make you a minimal amount faster. 2 laps per day, or 3 laps per day, or 4 laps per day, now we start seeing that there's some actual gain that's going on. But at these really, really low levels, it's like just sprinkling ground with water. There's so little that it doesn't even soak down into the roots and the plants can't use it. So it'd be irrigating for 30 seconds a day or something ridiculous like that. At stage 3 is where the input actually starts to harm the output. So we know that's no good either. Okay? So stage 1 and stage 3 are not reality. Stage 2 is where input use always takes place. And the question is, well, how much should I use? We don't necessarily want to maximize output. I mean, could we get 300 bushels per acre of corn in Nebraska? Absolutely. The reason why we don't do it is because it's too expensive to do so. And that's where our decision rules come into play. So the traditional decision rule that we have in economics is to produce so long as marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost. Then this is assuming a constant marginal revenue and an increasing marginal cost, and we're just looking at each individual successive unit. As I produce more, as long as there's some additional profit, the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost, I should keep marching forward. Now we get a little bit leery of getting to this point because there's some idea that perhaps you have taken away some of this profit, but you haven't. It's additional profit. So as long as there's anything positive, we continue on. Now we refine these decision rule, or this decision rule. We say, no. What we really need to do is produce so long as something called the marginal value product is greater than or equal to the marginal input cost. And that is something that's slightly different. The marginal value product, MVP, is the additional value of more production because I'm using more of an input. So the marginal input cost could be fertilizer, or it could be irrigation, or it could be labor. And the marginal value product is simply equal to the marginal physical product times the price of the output. So if we take that three-stage production function, so this is my input, this is my output, and this is total product, the change in total product is the additional product that we get from using an input. So we would take that and it looks like that. Marginal product, not marginal revenue. Notice it increases until stage 1 because my slope is increasing. And then it decreases but stays positive, meaning that it's adding to my output until the peak of the total product curve, and then it becomes negative. Well, if this marginal product is in bushels or pounds or some physical unit, if we multiply that times the price of the output, then we get something called marginal value product. How much is that marginal product actually worth? But then we have a third rule. And that third rule is that as long as my marginal physical product is greater than or equal to the price of the input divided by the price of the output. So think about how this makes some actual sense. So let's say that the input is labor, and the price of labor is $10, and the price of the output, sandwiches, we'll say that that's $5. This is saying that you should continue to use labor as long as the additional labor is garnering you at least 2 sandwiches. Think about that. The price of the input, 10, divided by the price of the output, 5, is 2. I need to get 2 $5 sandwiches out of an additional laborer to justify the hiring. Okay? This would be another way to look at a decision rule. All 3 of them are actually the same. Now I'm going to take a moment and prove that here in a second, but I want to focus on this one. Because if we are at a profit maximizing level of input use, the marginal physical product is equal to the ratio of the price of the input divided by the price of the output. And it would seem as though if one of these changed, then it makes it seem like the marginal physical product changes, but that's not the case. What actually happens is if one of these changes, it assumes that you, the operator or manager, decides to use a different amount of that input. So for example, if the price of the output went from $5 to $10, now all of a sudden we don't have an equilibrium any longer. My marginal physical product was 2, and that was equal to 2, but now this is 1. So does that mean that our laborers are going to start making less sandwiches? No. It means now it makes sense to hire more, even though their marginal physical product is low because the store is full of laborers. But now, because sandwiches are expensive, it makes sense to use more input. All right. The textbook example of this is fertilizer. So if the price of fertilizer goes up, that means that the marginal physical product of fertilizer needs to go up as well, which means we use less of it. If the price of the output, in the textbook's case, corn, if it goes up, that means marginal physical product can fall, meaning we can use more of it. It makes more sense. Don't say we know how much fertilizer to use. You know how much fertilizer to use to get a specific yield, but we're talking about what yield maximizes profits. And if you're using lots of fertilizer and broad spectrum application, you're wasting a lot of it. If it becomes very expensive, that doesn't make sense. If the price of corn goes down, does it make sense to apply expensive inputs to produce inexpensive corn? It really doesn't. So think about that. We know the science behind input and output use, but the economics of it are pretty straightforward. Okay, so let's prove that these are all the same. Okay, so we have 3 rules. We have marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We have marginal value product is equal to marginal input cost. And we have the price of the input divided, marginal physical product should be equal to the price of the input divided by the price of the output. Now, before we mix and match, we have to remember that some of these things have different names. For instance, marginal revenue is the same thing as the price of the output. And the marginal input cost is equal to the price of the input. And the marginal value product is equal to marginal physical product times the price of the output. I think that's enough for now. Okay, so let's just start off with, and my marginal cost is equal to make sure I get this right.